And to start things off, I'd like to thank our 2020 sponsors. At Diamond level, we have Boggs Inspection and Guild Mortgage. At the Emerald level, we have Axia Home Loans, Commission Express, Fairway Mortgage, Auburn, Golden Moving and Storage, Old Republic Home Protection, SunWest Mortgage, WFG National Title, and at the Ruby level, Fidelity National Home Warranty and LotLauncher.com. So hopefully folks will consider our sponsors as they need their services and give them a call and make them feel useful. And at this time, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Bill Dedman is a Pulitzer Prize and Peabody Award-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, and keynote speaker. Bill received the 1989 Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting for his work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on The Color of Money. His series of racial discrimination by banks and savings and loan associations in middle-income Black neighborhoods. He has spoken on fair housing and fair lending issues to the Federal Reserve, HUD, banking and real estate associations. The articles in The Color of Money are online at they got the little link there of powerreporting.com. 30 years later, Bill was one of the 4 lead reporters on Newsday's undercover investigation of racial steering by real estate agents. Long Island Divided. The investigation, published in November 2019, revealed that Long Island's dominant residential real estate brokerages helped reinforce racial segregation through illegal steering of customers. Newsday's team received several national awards for their work, including a Peabody Award, and Long Island Divided and its 40-minute documentary film, Testing the Divide, are online at newsday.com and then /divided. Bill also uncovered the case of the reclusive copper heiress, Huguette Clark, in 2010, documenting her life in reports for NBC News. His notification book, the #1 New York Times bestseller, Empty Mansions, The Mysterious Life of Huguette Clark and the Spending of the Great American Fortune, tells the true story of Clark and her father, the Gilded Age industrialist who founded Las Vegas. Bill is a frequent speaker for financial planning groups and charities on the lessons learned from the Clark's family's failures in estate planning. Bill has reported for the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. Okay. So, Bill, looks like you won the Pulitzer Prize for an investigation into the mortgage lending practices. I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to hear a brief summary of that investigation, as well as to show how long you've been doing this and the breadth of it.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate all of you being here. It's gratifying that so many real estate associations have taken the investigation done by a group of journalists in New York as a sort of launch point for conversations around the country about fair housing. And so I'm hoping that, together we can look at some video clips from that production, and also that you'll find something in here, not just to be challenging, but to think about how you can take action on it. So about The Color of Money, the investigation in Atlanta was about banks that lent money in even the poorest white neighborhoods of Atlanta, but didn't lend money in even the wealthiest Black neighborhoods of Atlanta, even the neighborhoods where Coretta Scott King and Andrew Young and the vice presidents of Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines lived. And part of the lesson that we learned from that project was how small actions by companies can have a great effect in creating or perpetuating a segregated system. Companies, we looked, for example, at which real estate agents the lenders marketed their services to, where customers could put in a loan application, where branches had been closed, even where ATMs were located. And I think I learned from that something about how unintentional, probably, actions kept a long segregated map going. And I'd like to mention a later project that relates as well to what we're talking about here. It's about policing in Massachusetts, a project at the Boston Globe called Speed Trap. And it's just about the simple interaction at the window when you're speeding and the officer pulls you over and you know you're speeding, and some people get a ticket and some people get a warning. And we looked at all the tickets and warnings. And one thing that you can see statistically, you can see looking at them, is that you can predict who gets a ticket and who gets a warning quite accurately if you know the age and sex and race of the driver. Women, for example, young women get a break. There was one young college student with 5 warnings in 2 months. But that stops at about age 40, this break for women. It's the same as who gets roles in Hollywood. African-American and Latino men, especially younger men, were much more likely to get a ticket than a warning for, let's acknowledge, something that we're all doing when we're pulled over, which is speeding. Again, those were examples where we looked at public records through the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, through traffic tickets, to answer questions about what was happening. What is different about the Long Island Divided project and our documentary film is that we weren't coming along later looking at records. We were testing, sending out home buyers with video cameras, so you can watch people violating the laws. And I think it also really mattered that we were naming names. We weren't writing about the banks or the police. We were writing about specific agents and specific brokerages, and you can see the company logos and you can see their names in the videos. And I think that made a big difference in the impact.
All right, so the Newsday investigations become the most prominent example of the existence of race-based bias in real estate. Why did Newsday start the investigation to begin with?
So picture Long Island, which is a suburb of New York City stretching east from the city out 100 miles to the Hamptons, the famous resort area. It's a heavily segregated suburb, 3 million people, and maybe the most heavily segregated suburb in America. And it's like a lot of places, though, in that there are people from all backgrounds, people of all races and colors and nationalities live there. But especially African Americans of whatever wealth are concentrated in only a few communities. Out of more than 200 communities on Long Island, 8 of them include most of the African American residents. And so at Newsday, we had long heard anecdotes from Black home buyers, even our own staff, who had encountered problems when they tried to buy a home in a white or integrated area. And well, an anecdote doesn't make a story. The testing has long been done by fair housing groups and government agencies sending out pairs of home buyers or renters. And it's really the only way through testing to see how different customers are treated. You know, when you're stopped at the police officers writing that ticket or the warning, you have no way to know how another driver is treated. Did they get a ticket or a warning? You would not know. If you're a real estate customer, you have no way to know. You wouldn't make a complaint about steering because you wouldn't know how anybody else was treated. So testing is the only way to see how things are done. We did also notice that an anniversary was coming up. It was the 50th anniversary approaching of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So we wanted to see how things were going at that point. So we followed the methods used by fair housing agencies and used experts in the field as our referees on each of the cases. Let's dive in. Let me show you a little bit of our documentary film. It's called Testing the Divide. It's all at newsday.com/divided. And the problem that's highlighted in this video clip is what we call a barrier to entry, a failure to serve one customer at all when another customer in the same circumstance does get service. Let's look at this video clip.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional,
How can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want to get unless you don't want to store your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, oh, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, we shouldn't tell the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester, and they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
Pre-qualified, I guess. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, you know, about getting pre-approved.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out any money unless I do have a pre-qualification level. So I need to know that I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
All right. So can you break down the tests for us and who was tested and what were the outcomes?
Sure, Steve. So our Newsday team focused on home sales only, not any rentals. And we sent out first-time home buyers. These were not people who had a home to sell. They would go out one at a time. We'd send a white home buyer and then shopping for that person's family. And then separately an Asian American home buyer, we'd mix up who would go first, or a white and black, or a white and Hispanic were paired together. And the testers gave the agent the same circumstances and constraints on their home search. So they followed the same script. These were first-time home buyers. We chose people of the same gender. They were roughly the same age. They were dressed in the same business casual style. We even chose purses of a similar style for the women to carry and picked out shirts for the men. They would ask about the same geographic area or the same distance from the center city. They gave the same family size, the same stated price range, shopping up to a certain amount, same number of bedrooms. And if asked, they would have the same income or credit scores, or the minority purchaser would have slightly higher income or credit scores, but they were almost never asked for any financial information. And they had the same mortgage pre-approval status as you saw in that example. Now, we shopped for prices in different price ranges. So we went from entry level, which in New York pricing is about $400,000, up to the high end, about $7 million in the Hamptons. But it was always the same price range stated for both testers in a pair. And they saw the same agent. Now, that wouldn't really be necessary for a fair housing lawsuit if a fair housing agency or the state was doing an investigation, because under the law, two different agents at the same brokerage are also supposed to treat customers equally. But we thought it would be more fair and more persuasive to see how the same agent treated two customers. We did 86 of these matched pairs at 12 companies. And how did we choose the companies? Well, they're the 12 companies that together have control of the market. They have more than half of the sellers in our market. Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, Remax, as well as the large regional brands in our area. And we tested each company many times. The tests weren't done by journalists. We recruited citizen testers. They came from church groups, or mostly we used out-of-work actors because they're available. We would train them in their identities, how to answer questions in a neutral way. We dressed them the same, and we rigged up the video cameras. Let me give you one sidelight about your state law in Washington and the video cameras. Hidden recording of audio is allowed in most states, but there are about a dozen states where it's not allowed, where everybody being recorded has to give consent, and your state is one of those. So this kind of video recording with audio that's hidden wouldn't be allowed in your state. But you can still have testing, because testers can still meet with agents. You can still record phone calls. You can still see the communication between tester and agent. And you can debrief people and look at the listings and study the listings that they receive. So I want to mention what we did after the agents, after the home buyers went out. Then our team reviewed and transcribed 240 hours of videos and analyzed the thousands of listings that they got to see especially which school districts and communities the testers were given listings in. And then we gave all this to two fair housing experts, one who had done testing for the Justice Department and runs fair housing programs, and the other's the law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing law. And only if both of these referees independently threw a flag did we count an agent as out of bounds. We didn't want to use our judgment for that. Then we gave the agents and their brokerages all the details, videos, let them come in and watch the videos, and put the videos online so everyone could see them, along with the maps of the listings. My point is that this was a careful effort that took more than 3 years. This was not a drive-by investigation to create a YouTube video. So the results. The agents gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests, 4 out of 10 times. The results were not the same for each person in the pair, but it varied by race. 19% of the time, or 2 out of 10, Asian buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts, 19% of the time. 39% of the time, Hispanic buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts, 4 out of 10. And 49%, half the time, Black buyers were treated differently than white buyers. Now, most of the difference has been on that high, most of the attention has been on that difference for Black customers. But I wouldn't lose sight of the rest. If 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers or 2 out of 10 Asian buyers are being treated poorly half a century after the civil rights laws were passed, then I would say those are high numbers too. We viewed this as an effort to test the gatekeepers in real estate, the people who a first-time home buyer would encounter, to see how they perform. We let the brokerages choose the agents who were being tested. It was whoever was taking calls, whoever was taking walk-ins or email in, or this was back in the days of walk-ins. I think it's fair to say that, to summarize the result of our test, that most of these major national and regional real estate companies were contributing, let's say, to this racial segregation in our suburbs. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, do you think that these results would be substantially the same or not if we repeated the tests in Tacoma or in Seattle or Houston or Denver? Most of the differences that we found, let me describe how they varied. Most of the differences were caused by steering, and we'll talk more about steering, but overall, black buyers, for example, got fewer listings than white area. The wider the area, the fewer listings that a black buyer would get in that area. To be specific about that, agents directed 24%, a quarter of our minority home buyers, a quarter of them were just sent into different communities and school districts altogether than their white counterparts. Along with that, there were agents who refused to serve customers, like the example you saw. Most of that was based on pre-approval. Both buyers had no pre-approval or pre-qualification for a mortgage, but that was a barrier for one buyer, not for the other. Also, some agents wouldn't help our Black or Hispanic buyer unless they signed an exclusive contract. But then that same agent wouldn't require a contract from a white buyer. Those were the main differences. Now, I've spoken of it in terms of differences of treating the different people differently, but think about it from the neighborhood perspective. We had neighborhoods that were mostly white in residents, where most of the listings went to white buyers, and black buyers especially could not get many listings given in those areas. But we also had, so that's the sort of classic steering. Some people sent one way, other people sent another. But we also had the heavily minority areas, those communities with the highest African-American population especially, where no one was given any listings. Everybody, whatever their race, was steered around those communities. So think about it, who's harmed there? Well, all the buyers are harmed, but also the communities are harmed. The experts pointed out under the Fair Housing Act, who has the lawsuit there? Well, it's anybody who's ever sold a home or tried to sell a home, and their listing agent from the past decade has a lawsuit against the companies that are steering around their communities, harming their resale values. And then the other thing that we saw or heard were inappropriate comments by agents. These were almost always said to our white home buyers. The minority buyers would come back to our office, would say, "Oh, she was so nice. I can't believe he was really helpful." And only later, when they saw the video, did they realize that they didn't get the same treatment as the white buyer. Here's a video clip that's specifically about this problem of inappropriate comments, which were almost always made to the white buyer.
Hispanic community came in, and they really took over Springs and Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
I like Freeport. Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value.
All the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. Any United Nations. Okay.
Because you might be more comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of.
Bayshore has two school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood school districts. You want to have Bayshore school district.
I can't say anything, but I encourage you, I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your white diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it. You know, you have the knowledge of the areas.
Yes.
I don't want to use the word. I use the word in the areas.
Yeah. How are you, Russ? How you doing? Good.
Either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You want to be, I don't think you should be now, Mon. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yeah.
And in the same breath, you mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No, like a horse, even.
I can add that the inappropriate comments are easy to focus on. I have a sense that some agents may have gotten the message through training or culture that complying with fair housing laws means not saying the wrong thing, as though it's some sort of political correctness thing, or not saying the wrong thing to the wrong person who might complain about it. But it appears that we need perhaps more attention to steering, to differential treatment on what people do instead of what they say. And are they giving the same advice, the same information, treating all customers equally?
So that's the definition of steering. That's what you're saying. Or you want to just kind of give us a summary of steering, just make sure we have all the nuances down?
Yeah, so you've heard about steering. You know what steering is, but it's sort of an imprecise term that's used as a catch-all for various behaviors, such as showing one person an apartment while telling another person that no apartment is available, or telling one person that there's no housing in that area, you wouldn't be able to afford anything in that neighborhood, but showing housing in that price range in that area to others. But there are other forms of steering, asking one customer for ID, but not the other customer. Making unsolicited comments, as we saw, about race or religion or ethnicity of people who live in an area, or about the schools, or crime, or resale values, as a way of encouraging or discouraging someone from living there, especially while giving contrary information or being silent on those matters to someone else. You'd really like Freeport? Oh, you don't want to buy in Freeport, to two different customers. We heard agents warning about bad resale values in an area they would recommend to others. Or just providing more service to one group than another. Overall, our white testers got 50% more listings than our black testers. It was more equal for Asian and Hispanic buyers with whites. The effect of this on communities is really strong, especially in terms of the resale values and the home equity. I think we think about steering as something that affects individuals, and in this case, testers. But think about those communities with the concentrated black populations, and these are middle and upper income areas. And the home equity is the money that the grandkids use to go to college. And that's what's being harmed here by steering. We are not saying that real estate agents created segregation, the segregation of our suburbs. Many of you have probably read Richard Rothstein's wonderful book called The Color of Law, a few years old now, which lays segregation at the feet of government action back to the 1930s, with racial covenants allowed on limiting who could buy a property and financing available only to white buyers. White GIs coming home from World War II could get a VA loan to buy a home, and black veterans could not. So Professor Rothstein focuses on government action, not the actions of appraisers or lenders or real estate agents. But it's at least clear that realtors through the years have followed the industry's segregated lines. We're not saying that real estate agents created segregation, but may be helping to perpetuate it. Here's an example with just sort of a classic version of steering. One man and his wife and teenager are warned off of living in an area, while another man and his wife and teenager are told it would be a good place to live.
Kelvin Toon is a black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community. a community that is 80% Hispanic and Black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're nice people. When
we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going to visit. Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or? Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
So do you think the agents included in the documentary were knowingly steering? I mean, some of them did make comments that would certainly lead you to believe that. Or do you think of most of it or some of it was unconscious bias?
That's an interesting question, Steve. Some do refer, well, I shouldn't be steering, but that's sort of the equivalent of hold my beer, something bad is about to happen. I think the first point about this to make is that it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not. It makes no difference. The Fair Housing Act and your state and local laws cover behavior, not thoughts or motives. The law is not a mind reader and neither are journalists. If you're treating one person better than another, similarly situated person, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories in the Fair Housing Act, then you violated the law. To remind you, those are color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, by which we usually mean having children or how a larger family is or being pregnant. You also have state and local laws that may include marital status and sexual orientation. It is interesting, however, though it doesn't matter, to speculate about the motivations of the agents. If we're going to stop steering, then it's worth thinking about why people might do it. Let's speculate for a minute. Some agents may be, in effect, profiling. That is, assuming, consciously or not, that the person of color can't really afford homes in that given price range, or can't qualify for the mortgage, or will be wasting the agent's time, while accepting the same price range without question from the white buyer. One of the tricky things about profiling is that it is so ineffective. When we talk about profiling, often it's discussed as though it's a shortcut to success, but it's thought of as some sort of politically incorrect thing. But experts say that the real problem with profiling is that it doesn't work. Sure, it might be a human rights violation, that's bad, but let's take this to a different context. Who plays video games or dresses a certain way is not a good way to predict which teenager might be a school shooter. Acquiring weapons and making threats are better predictors. Religion is not a good way to identify who might be a terrorist. Too many innocent people get identified that way, and not enough people planning something get identified that way. So it's bad counterterrorism work. It's bad policing. Mm-hmm. And race is not a good way to identify which customers can afford a home. My favorite video clip about profiling is from the film Pretty Woman. Remember Julia Roberts is shopping and she's dressed like a prostitute and they won't serve her. And she comes back later. She had the millionaire's credit card and she comes back later and holds up the shopping bags and says, "You work on commission, right?" Big mistake. Huge. That's a point about the ineffectiveness of profiling. It's bad counterterrorism, it's bad policing, and it's bad real estate. And more to the point, it's illegal. Okay, another motivation. Some agents might think that they'll make more money faster with less effort if they show people homes where you'll feel comfortable. We heard that phrase a couple of times. But you can't assume that people want segregated neighborhoods. Some people want integrated neighborhoods. And besides, it's illegal. It's possible that some agents may have a strong prejudice or anti-minority bias. I assume that that is a very tiny group and is not the main part of this problem. It is possible that some agents don't have a bias, but are acting out of sort of a referred bias. Let's say you know your tooth might hurt because your neck's sore. You know, they might be thinking of bias elsewhere in the market. So they might think that potential sellers might be angry if the agent brought minority buyers into a mostly white area. And those sellers and their neighbors are potential customers for the agent. Or an agent might think that appraisers or lenders might be biased and make it hard to close a sale. It's possible. Again, none of that matters. In general, on issues of race, it is easy to apply all the heat to the questions. Are they saying that we're racist? Or who might be? That's a waste of time. It is much more productive to apply light to the question, is what we're doing treating people equally or differently? And under the law, it's what you do that counts. It's important to remember that our testers were completely unaware that they were being treated better or worse. They would only see these differences when we would sit them down. And I want to show you a little video clip about this. You'll meet some of our testers here, but also hear from a fair housing expert who works with testers.
All right.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race, and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test. And you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Elmont, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, Elmont.
I do remember him, he was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map, I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like,
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily great in terms of school districts, safety, crime, resale.
Let's talk about the gentleman with the map. He looked like General Patton planning the invasion of Sicily. I have to say, one of the patterns that startled us, like this agent, essentially telling buyers not to get off the highway till they got to a certain exit. And in result, they're passing by all the neighborhoods with any sizable minority residents. And what surprised us was that these were new customers, agents meeting them for the first time. It's the opening presentation to the new customer, which includes inappropriate comments or information that violates the Fair Housing Act. None of this was offhand. In other words, this seemed to be the material that was built into their sales pitch, their standard guidance for narrowing the search to certain neighborhoods. I hate to say it, but it seemed that these agents were including steering as the service that they were selling.
What roles do schools play in the actions of agents?
Schools are the hardest part of this. Time and again, we heard agents tell buyers, everything's by schools. It's all done by schools. And notice that because American school districts are so segregated by race in many communities, that directing someone to a certain school district is the same as directing them to an area with a higher or lower population of each minority group. It's hard to realize it, but America's schools are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago. More segregated now than 30 years ago. And schools are the mechanism by which segregation happens. It was routine for us to hear agents use schools as the sorting mechanism, touting one district over another. These are blue ribbon schools. Those are declining. Those are not good schools. But then not giving the same information to the other buyer. And, you know, around the country, some agents have picked up the idea through the years that they can't talk about schools. It might not be bad advice, but they speak of it as though it's illegal to talk about schools, but that's not true. The Fair Housing Act doesn't say that. Agents can give straightforward, factual information about schools or answer questions. If someone asks you, where did your kids go to school? You can tell them that. And you can refer customers to websites with information. The problem arises when the agents are picking and choosing or encouraging and discouraging different districts for different customers, or making comments about demographics in schools to steer or discourage customers. There's the next step, I think, here is let's listen to a little bit of a clip about schools. This includes our fair housing professor talking about schools.
I said, do you really want your future children going to Amityville School District?
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, is in demand because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86 paired tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
You know, like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is the race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
If you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and you're not going to like those schools.
Agents, including that last agent, helpfully sent back to the Newsday office our testers with handwritten lists of which schools to consider and which schools to avoid, but she would send back different testers with different lists. Notice that you don't have to talk about race to be steering. Say you talk about school test scores. Write this on the blackboard 100 times. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. School test scores tell you mostly how wealthy are the parents who send their kids to that school. Wealth is a very good predictor of test scores. Not absolute, but very good. And race in America is a good predictor of wealth. So race is a good predictor of test scores. A high-performing so-called school is often just one with higher wealth parents. And a school with lower test scores might actually be the higher performing one because it's bringing up the scores of students who are growing up with fewer advantages. Just recently, greatschools.org, many of you know this site, the school ranking website used by so many realtors, has realized this pitfall and it's changed its ratings, especially in states where it was basing the ratings entirely on test scores because it's realized that that perpetuates segregation. NAR has spoken up about this in favor of that change. So what should an agent do? Some have decided that you can't talk about schools at all, but you can answer factual questions. But you get in a gray area when you start to use labels such as good or nice or high performing, because one question you have to ask yourself is, how are any of us experts on schools and their programs, and who has a music program, and what the particular needs might be of a buyer? They should be doing their own research about schools.
What was the reaction from the real estate industry and specifically agents on Long Island?
Well, first, it seems fair to say that we've raised awareness of these issues. John Legend was talking about our project today at the conference of NAR. Thrilled my younger colleagues. New York's governor and attorney general announced investigations, and those are continuing. Often I'm asked what happened to the agents in the videos, and we didn't focus on trying to cause a disciplinary case for a particular agent. If that had been our focus, we would have tested the individual agents with multiple pairs of testers. But we focused on the companies, which we tested multiple times. The agents and their brokers were called to testify before a state Senate committee hearing, and you can watch it online. It's really something. They were sworn in and asked questions, and some handled it well, saying they hadn't understood that they were violating the law, but they realized that what they said was inappropriate. But the others got a public thrashing. The agent who earlier you heard say, follow the school bus, see what mothers are waiting to meet the bus, she told the senators that she just meant for the customers to learn where the bus routes were. And the agent who said the Hispanics are taking over the neighborhood, he said he meant that in a positive way. And one senator told that agent, on behalf of everyone with a brain, I'd like to tell you how ridiculous you sound. The most surprising part of the hearing was that the brokers all said that they had reviewed the tests and interviewed the agents and found nothing wrong. Not a single one said that any violation had occurred. And their position seemed to be that steering wasn't intentional and therefore it wasn't illegal. And you know better. And the senators know better. And we'll see whether New York State accepts that explanation. We do expect greater enforcement. If you want to stop speeding, you'll turn on the radar. HUD also has been talking about stepping up enforcement of the Fair Housing Act through more testing nationwide. That has not been the policy of the current administration, but it appears that there will be a new administration and maybe some new fair housing policies from HUD starting in January. We'll see.
Well, I guess after all that work you've done, we do have one more question I'd love to ask. And that based on your investigations, what do you think the best ways are to combat racism in real estate?
Oh, so, the best approach may not be to combat racism, is to combat unequal treatment. Let's think about it that way. NAR has responded vigorously to our investigation, and I think it's worth talking about what its efforts are doing. Just a couple weeks before our stories landed, NAR had already hired Brian Green, who came from HUD's Fair Housing Office, is now NAR's Director of Fair Housing Policy. So welcome to the new job, Brian. It's been a busy year. Mm-hmm. NAR has a new program which it calls ACT, A-C-T, A for accountability, C for culture change, and T for training. All this has to do with fair housing. So quickly, A stands for accountability. NAR is working with state associations, Washington and everywhere, to ensure that state licensing laws meet a national standard for effective fair housing requirements and enforcement to hold real estate agents accountable. NAR is also developing a voluntary program of self-testing, sort of a cookbook of how to test agents, which could be used by real estate companies to test whether their own agents are complying with the law. That would be a huge change. Now, you might reasonably say, well, I don't think they would do that. Well, the CEO of Realogy, Ryan Gorman, the company that owns several of the largest brands, has testified before the committee in New York that he wants to institute a self-testing program for their brands, which includes Century 21, Coldwell Banker, Sotheby's International Realty, Corcoran Group. Imagine real estate companies testing their own agents. That will be different. ACT, C stands for culture change. You know, there were changes regarding hate speech to the ethics rules at NAR this week. But you know that fair housing was already a core component of the Realtors Code of Ethics. You know that. But during our lifetime, that same code of ethics required realtors to enforce racial segregation. It was a violation of the Realtor Code of Ethics to sell a home to a Black person in a white neighborhood. So let's acknowledge that cultures can be changed and that there is a long tradition in America of redlining, of blockbusting, of racial covenants on deeds, of predatory subprime lending that strips home equity out of minority neighborhoods. These are not just historical facts, but some of them continue today and have effects continuing today. Just this year, we saw a study about how appraisals are done differently in Black neighborhoods, to the detriment of the homeowners. So changing the culture, NAR says, is probably the most difficult part. I urge you to look up a document online called NAR's Fair Housing Declaration, which is an interesting personal statement, I guess you'd call it, of commitment to fair housing. Now, schools is a big part of this culture change, and NAR is looking for ways to help realtors not perpetuate segregation through their advice on schools. So last, T for training. Newsday's team went to training in New York, which already required refresher courses in fair housing for every agent. And our reporters shared the curriculum with experts who found the training very weak and jokey and barely mentioning steering. The State Association of Realtors in New York suspended its training and is rewriting the curriculum. NAR is improving its training materials. It's building a course. It already has some films online about unconscious bias, but it's building a course for brokers that they can teach to their agents on unconscious bias. So watch for that. And it is producing also a sort of a game or simulation, which was announced this week, called Fairhaven, where you, in playing the game or simulation, you can be the customer or the agent, and it shows you the effects of fair housing violations, and it shows the pitfalls in fair housing in that relationship between the customer and the agent. NAR is also making a film about good role models, about realtors who follow best practices and treat everybody equally and prosper while doing it. I think all of this is a useful effort. Let me offer a layman's perspective. You know, often during our project, we're like air traffic controllers. We're sending out the testers, they come back, we watch their videos, and we kept discussing, you know, we don't know real estate, but if we were running a real estate brokerage and one of our goals was to stop our agents from violating the Fair Housing Act, what would we do? What would that look like? And how hard would it be? Just a couple of layman's perspectives. It seems clear that agents need to have rigorous standards for what they do and don't do with every customer. If we give some customers this brochure on school districts, give it to everyone. Time and again, we saw customers come back from the same agent, one with a fat folder and one with a skinny folder. You can fix that. We also wondered, you know, who's watching to see if steering is happening in your brokerage? Do brokers look behind or audit their agents? That is, In lending, there's the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and we can see where applications are made, what happens to them. It's a public record. We don't have a Real Estate Disclosure Act, but is someone looking over the shoulder of the agent to say, what were the criteria of this customer? What were they asking for? And then what school districts did we give them? What communities did we send them listings to? It's in your computer. It's in the MLS computer. Who's looking at that data to see whether everybody gets the same areas? I wonder if your MLS software, like the one in New York, really encourages the picking and choosing of neighborhoods or school districts. That's where the home search starts. Checking boxes to turn on individual school districts and communities. It really leads to people making different choices. And what are your process? What's your process in your office? Do you require pre-approval from everyone or no one? Do you ask credit scores of everyone or no one? Do you ask for ID? Do you ask about income for everyone or no one? Here's a very brief clip from our law professor, Bob Schwem from Kentucky, talking about that kind of equal treatment.
I'm a law professor at the University of Kentucky, and I've been a law professor for a long number of years. All we're asking in these tests, you get two people who come in and ask for exactly the same thing. Why don't you give them the same listings? Why don't you pre-qualify them in exactly the same way? It's not that big a burden. This is a law. This should be treated like a tax law or any other law. You have to obey this law, and particularly if you're in a licensed business like real estate agents, if you can't obey the law, you ought to just get out.
Well, the professor really steps up to the plate there. Let's also acknowledge that a fix for fair housing violations is not to say, well, we respond forcefully to all complaints and we don't get any complaints. As you know, rarely would anyone know they're being steered. So how would they know to complain? But let's quickly look at some of the possible fixes, or at least things that might help. You could argue that a fix is diversifying your workplace, and that has many benefits. Let's acknowledge, however, that we saw steering by agents of many races and nationalities, just as you could see police brutality by some officers of all colors. This is not a problem of just people of one color. You could argue that a fix is adding offices in minority areas. We noted that our 12 companies have more than 250 branch offices, and not a single one is in the 8 communities where most of the racial minorities live on Long Island. So lack of familiarity with those areas might lead to steering around them, right? And similarly, representing sellers in those communities, which those big brands rarely do, representing sellers would increase familiarity. You could argue that the fix is better training. New York already has training, but it was slipshod. So not just having training and requiring it, but what's the quality of the training? In general, NAR offers a rather sort of simple, straightforward suggestion of how to stop steering. Provide customers with listings based on their objective criteria. Home size, other attributes, not on vague terms such as nice neighborhood or good schools or safe, objective criteria to make decisions for everybody. And pay attention to unconscious biases, and when evaluating the customer's objective desires, ask yourself, well, why did I eliminate certain areas? As a layman, I'm left with the question, why do real estate agents need to be in the business of eliminating areas at all? As the professor says, if you treat everybody equally, if you give every customer access to all the listings within their price range, we won't have steering. So it might be that the best way to stop illegal steering may be to stop steering customers at all. Why should real estate agents, ask yourself, why should real estate agents be picking and choosing communities for home buyers? That's my view. Now, I realize that quality control is difficult when people work from home, they're independent, they're self-motivated. It's hard to have quality control in that sort of environment. But I'm assuming that all of you want to make sure that everybody who calls or emails or someday walks into your office is treated fairly. I'm just hoping that you'll think about, how do we do it? How does it work now? What steps can we take in our office to ensure that that happens? We've got a full series of stories online and a 40-minute video called Testing the Divide, and it's all at newsday.com/divided. I encourage you to share that with your team. Share it with your friends on Facebook. See what ideas you can come up with in your office, in your friends group, for ways to make sure that everybody is treated equally.
All right, so it's time for some open questions and answers. If folks have questions, I know some are being typed in.
Good.
Well, Karen and Emily can help us monitor that, but what do folks have here?
I think Dave Jones had to leave the call. He had a 10 o'clock appointment, but Marguerite's been active in the chat. I just want to throw it to Marguerite. If you have anything that you wanted to ask at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Bill, first of all, I'm a big fan. I'm very excited. I was very excited to see our local association was hosting you. I follow you on Twitter, has moved to Tacoma, big fan. But as we're having this conversation.
You almost had me moving to Tacoma, but okay, I know there's a but coming, go ahead.
But I'm like clawing the walls listening to you talk, because I feel like we're missing a big portion of the problem here, which is our clients are also racist. Our clients are also asking us to steer them. And when I watched the LI Divided videos, I really wondered what it would be like if you had sent people in who were like, I want to live in a white neighborhood, or I want to live in a good neighborhood. And like you said, like having Black agents or Hispanic agents doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because the wink, wink, nod, nod understanding that's happening, that we live in a racial hierarchy and white neighborhoods have more services and more affluent people. Like we are in a segregated racist system with clients who are coming in. What they want from us, they perceive our value as the ability to steer them. And I think that component is missing from the advice and from the training.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I have heard people talk about, what do you do in that circumstance? And we all have, either experienced or heard about the client who says, I don't want you to bring any minorities here to my home, or my neighbors won't like it. Or,
well, that's a little more explicit than what I think we usually hear.
Right. Or you get, a lot of advertising is essentially, I think the core question is this: what is the service that realtors are left to provide? Do you fear that if you strip away, we'll find you the right neighborhood and not the wrong neighborhood? Do you fear that you'll be left without a service to sell in this environment where people can look up listings at Zillow or 100 other places? And I think that's part of the fear. But it does take some backbone to be able to say, I can't advise you about that. I'm in a regulated business, and you'll have to do your own research about neighborhoods. It does take some backbone. You're trying to scrap an income together to say to someone, no, that's not something that I can do.
It would be amazing if, as we do this revamp of training, like scripting around that would be very helpful. Like to have the clients themselves asking for this, because I think that's the part we're trying to pretend like our clients are neutral. They are not neutral.
Well, role playing can be very helpful. I agree. Too much of the training that we send our reporters to, it would tick off categories in fair housing and tell you about the Civil Rights Act of 1863, and then they'd tell some jokes and everybody'd go home. There wasn't much to challenge people, well, how does it really work?
All right, other questions?
I have one, but Karen, there's no raise hand in the reaction spot, at least for me, so I don't know how to do it. So
function.
This is very good, Bill. And as a designated broker, I'm looking at continually, trying to work with my agents on this. I have two questions, I guess. Number one is I hear what you're saying is that really where the problem comes in more is treating people differently. And I've always hated the fact, I went and bought a car a while ago, and right when I walked in, the salesperson after 10 seconds says, I know the car for you. And my attitude is, you don't even know me. How do you know which car I should have? And I totally get that part of it. So I am curious that, did you have any testers go in and say, I want a great school district? And the agent said, okay, go here. But they said it consistently with multiple people.
Yeah, what happens, you know, we had agents say that schools were important to them. We didn't have we had testers say that. We didn't have any testers who, they weren't trained to say, I want a great school district, because everybody wants a great school district. That's right, everybody, and everybody deserves one. So we would express, we have kids, and it was usually part of the intake interview. Do you have kids? How old are your kids? Oh, so schools are important. Yes, schools are important. And that was the same for everyone. We did have some agents who passed the test, you know, 60%, 6 out of 10, 60% of the agents passed the test. There were 2 companies out of the 12 where all their agents that we tested passed the test. There were some things that we didn't call out of bounds that I guess you could have, but you know, we judged it the way we did, and 2 of those 12 companies passed. Sometimes this works out to be very subtle. I'll show you, I'll mention to you something we didn't count as out of bounds. We didn't dock them for this, but it was clear that agents would quickly get more affinity with our white buyers in terms of telling the buyer where the agent lives. Agents were much more likely to say to a white buyer, oh, my kids went to these schools, you'll really like those schools, or I live in this community. There was one agent who was offering to find our white buyer babysitting for her kids in the neighborhood where the agent lived, but didn't even tell the minority buyer what school district or community the agent lived in. That's some sort of affinity happening. They can see them as a potential neighbor. Now, that's not a fair housing violation, offering babysitting. We didn't count them out. But some of this, you know, that probably falls under something where implicit bias training would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you.
Karen Cochran, did I say your last name correctly? Has a question?
Yes, well, as a comment, just based on what you just said, I do the exact same thing with my clients. If they ask me about schools, I tell them where my kids went, what neighborhood I live in. It doesn't even come to my mind that if I have a white client, that they're not going to want to hear where I live and where my kids went to school. So I know that the race issue is there, but my focus isn't on the race issue. My focus is on helping my buyers within the price range that they're in find the house that they want, and I send them all the listings that are in the price range that they want. If we focus, this is just my opinion, if we focus on the rate that there's a race issue out there, then there's going to be a race issue when we're dealing with our clients. If we focus on finding them the best home in the price range that they have and let them choose, let them do the research on the school systems, like you were saying, let them do their own research. And same thing with the areas, just like we do a neighborhood review. Here's a house that you like, let's get you under contract, do a walkthrough, check out, and base it on what you feel comfortable with.
So in terms of what you're describing as your practices, it sounds to me like you're spot on and good practices. The idea that paying attention to race is what causes racial differences is just hooey. You know, having officers monitor the highways for speeding is not what causes speeding.
No, but I guess I'm said that maybe a little bit wrong, you know, not with what you're saying. I think that I'm trying to think of an example.
Well, so I understand. People commonly say if we weren't talking about race so much, we wouldn't have such racial problems.
Yeah,
but,
no, that's not what
or
I'm
people
saying.
say, I'm colorblind, I don't see race.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying either.
We all see race, yeah.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying, but I do think that there are people who are not racist and are not doing the wrong things, but because of what's going on right now in our around our world, are being hypersensitive, so that it ends up being steering in a weird way. And I don't know, I'm not sure if I'm saying everything correctly. But
the best takeaway is from all this is just have the same practices for everybody. As an example, I would say tell all your customers where your kids went to high school, not just if they ask. Then you won't have to worry about whether you're telling some people one information and not telling others. If, in other words, if there's a checklists are very helpful. If there's a little bit of rigor in what we do for everyone, and if there's a little bit of supervision by brokers, one of the things that came up in the state Senate hearings is the senators in New York don't quite understand how a broker can supervise 100 or 200 or 700 agents and know whether they're steering or not. The level of supervision is partly at issue. What did they ask for? What did we show them? What listings did we send them? Is there a form that keeps track of that in your office? I mean, I think procedures are worrying about who's racist and who's not is not very helpful, but worrying about the procedures in your office can be a way to get closer to treating everybody equally. You could just think of it as protecting yourself from ending up in the wrong end of a fair housing lawsuit or action against your license. Obviously we have multiple motives for obeying the law.
Jeff Williams has been waiting very patiently.
Thanks for this conversation. So we recently ran into something, and I'm just wondering, probably from the Brain Trust, how we'd handle this. But we've got clients moving up from Los Angeles, and they want public schools, and they want public schools that score well. Great schools is not accurate at all. I mean, it's not something that I particularly think is going to put these people in a location that they want to be in. They've asked to be in a more diverse community, which, we applaud. And yet they're going to, good schools or great schools is steering them to Gig Harbor. They've said that they don't want to live in Gig Harbor, but that's where they're going to end up probably looking. Gig Harbor is probably one of the least diverse communities that we serve currently. So I'm just wondering.
You can talk frankly about that. I mean, you can say to them, school test scores drive a lot of these kinds of rankings, and school test scores are mostly driven by wealth, which is affected by income, and you're going to end up with a not very diverse community. If one of your goals that you've told us is to be in a diverse community, if you just look at these ratings, that's not going to get you there. Here, there are websites where if you drill down, they can see if they care about other attributes of the school district, they can find them. So I think the best advice is to refer them to websites that have detailed information about the schools. Great Schools has some, and there are others, often from your state, right? Sometimes from news organizations.
It's tough though, because Great Schools is linked to so many search engines that we have, and that's the default. And so, and for us to sit there and say, well, Great Schools is giving Wainwright a 3 out of 10, but we know from just anecdotal evidence from our friends and clients that Wainwright's a great school, or not a great school, but just a certainly good school and a diverse school. That's a tough position for us to be put in.
I understand. It is a problem. And crime is a similar problem that causes, we often found that crime websites were not very accurate in having local crime percentages, rates, and not all crimes are equal. People don't think very deeply about these things. And if you're coming in from out of town, you don't know neighborhoods. And it's hard to say to them, do your own research in a physical sense during a pandemic, and they can't visit as many schools. And it's hard when they're out of town and they're only in for short periods. I understand this is difficult. I would say it's okay to frankly discuss with them some of the complexities of it and educate them about that a little bit more. I mean, there are articles, for example, online about great schools not having very accurate ratings. So.
And Bill, do you have time for another question?
I have all the time in the world. I'll exhaust you all. Don't worry.
Melanie?
Thank you. So I'm curious, if you guys are doing this over in the East Coast, that's what I hear a lot about, but I don't hear about anything going on in the Northwest or, multiple other areas. So does
you mean
NAR?
Testing?
Yes, testing. Mm-hmm. And so personally, I'm just hearing about a lot of the East Coast testing going on. How do we get the testing going on in other areas, like throughout the United States?
Well,
I don't know. Associations.
I don't know if your state is doing testing. HUD has done testing that's nationwide. Nationwide usually mean, focusing on maybe 10 cities at a time. HUD has not announced much about, it doesn't talk about companies. It doesn't talk so much about differences from city to city. It's just sort of put out general numbers nationwide, which has less oomph. I guess someone on the call here may know, and I don't know, if your state licensing professionals do any testing, or if they just respond to complaints against agents.
I'm not aware that DOL, so our licensing authority is Department of Licensing. I'm not aware, and maybe somebody can correct me, that they do testing, but we do have the Fair Housing Center of Washington here in Tacoma, and they've spoken at a couple of our events before, and they are actively doing testing. And I'm going to assume that the Human Rights Commission is probably also doing testing.
Fair housing groups do most of the testing in the country, and they're nonprofits, and testing is very expensive. And, our project took us 3 years. Don't ask us what it costs. And testing is also hard on sales. It's much easier to test for rental discrimination. Is the apartment available? No. Is it? Yes. Is it? No. Well, there's your violation. And it's much more complicated when people are looking for housing and you want to get listings and study those. And so less of it is done. They do more rental, and more lawsuits. Fair housing lawsuits involve rental than sales. I suspect that our project will change that. The biggest change would be if the companies are doing testing. You get Realogy testing its agents. It's the biggest real estate company in the country. That would have the biggest difference. I haven't answered your question about the Northwest because I don't know what's done there, but your local fair housing group that's mentioned would be the first place to ask.
It's interesting, Bill, right? When you mentioned that having firms do the testing themselves would have a bigger impact. We had a comment in the chat that, gosh, we wonder if we could hire, the Fair Housing Center to do testing independently for firms. So,
well, yes, in a way, that's what NAR is suggesting. NAR is basically saying, let's hook these companies up with the fair housing groups that already know how to do it, to at least give them a cookbook and maybe to give them the manpower to do it. Let's be skeptical a little bit about self-regulation. Often industries propose self-regulation when they're afraid that some government agency is going to regulate them. And so this will be a way to get the government off our back. Okay, that happens. But to have a CEO of a company saying, I think we ought to be testing our agents seems to me like a very significant step. So we'll see what happens from that.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Does anyone else have questions for Bill while we have him here on the call? I see Denny again.
Is that it? Or are we done?
Just one more question. I've learned a lot again, Bill, and I really like it, and I want to work with the agents. My hope is, and I know we've talked a lot about what not to do, and I totally get it. The word that goes through my mind is trusted advisor. I see that. I like it. People are coming in from national areas anymore. I talk to my money guy for my retirement stuff. I ask him his opinions on what should I invest in, and I trust that he's giving me good information, and I'm trusting that he's giving me the similar information that he's giving anybody else and not leading me in a wrong direction. And I get that. My hope is that we can focus on teaching us, all of us, what to do, because people are calling in saying, hey, I'm in New York today. I'm moving into your area, but I can't move there until I have a house already. Would you please share with me where a good place is for me to live? And I understand that I shouldn't say, you know, Bill, you should live here because of this. I get that. But I should be able to learn how to say, what is important when you say good? You know, tell me what you want. And then what we need to do is learn the tools. And I wrote these down here. Is my job as a realtor is to speak on the facts and to offer resources.
Yeah.
And I think if we teach our realtors, hey guys, when they say I want good, your question is what do you mean by good? I want schools with test levels higher than this. Okay, go to this site and here's the test levels if that's what's important to you. And my hope is, again, that we can work on teaching our realtors this is how to do it well, and as opposed to just focusing on what you've done wrong. So,
Yeah,
anyway.
is it, just as you would ask, is it important to you to have the master bedroom on the first floor? Is it important to you to be able to walk to a grocery store, or is it important to you to be in a quiet place where you drive everywhere? I mean, these are objective criteria, and it sounds to me like good advice. A whole other area we haven't talked about is these sort of begging buyer letters to sellers, and the fair housing implications of those letters with their enclosed photographs. They're a lot of trouble, and that's a subject for another day's conversation. But think about the fact that there's a lot of fair housing implications in those buyer letters.
I think our Washington Realtors legal hotline attorney has done a video on those letters. And I believe that our members have been cautioned because of the fair housing violations to not use the love letters. I see Colleen has raised her hand, and then I have somebody else that has a phone number. So go ahead, Colleen.
I was just going to say that, in 22 years next month, good Lord, I'm not that old. I don't know how that happened. But anyway, of this business, I kind of fall into Karen's category. I didn't have kids, so I can't talk about schools. I don't pay attention to crime, so I don't really know what happens in my areas. So people have asked me things all over the years. And yes, I've taken a strong stance. I've fired people when they said, we were out on the front porch and we said, do more of those people live in this neighborhood? I'm like, what people? And I looked at them, I said, I don't know what you're asking me, but if you're asking me that question, we're probably not a fit. And I walked to my car and drove away. That was just kind of it. And I've always been consistent that this is how I'm going to treat my clients, just because I came out of an HR background too. It's like everybody is treated with the same consideration and the same policy. And so you tell me your objective criteria, I send you all the homes, you narrow down which ones you want to see. I don't really care what area they're in, just pick a home. And so I just think it's training on that level, like you're talking about, that we have to do, because there's no reason. And speaking of those letters, Karen, Bill, I've never presented them. I tell my sellers up front, you're going to get these letters. You can read them after you've made your choice, but not before, because I don't know what's in there might sway you, but it could be a violation, and I'm not going to put myself or you in that position. So so just everybody on there, send me letters. They don't see them, I don't care. No, just kidding. So, I mean, I just think we have to, and I own my broker, so we have to communicate this to our agents that this is how we perform. And if you're not performing within this, then maybe you're not a fit, but that's just, I take a little stiffer stance. But.
Thank you for that.
I don't know your name, but 253-691-7210. You're up.
There.
You still have a question? I don't know what your name is, but your phone number ends in 7210. All right, go ahead, Ann. Saw your hand was up.
Hi, thanks for putting this on, you guys. Bill, I saw you speak, I think at Inman in New York in January. You were on stage.
Some of my colleagues were there.
Some of your colleagues.
Yeah.
Okay, well, they did a great job there. And thanks for the change you've brought about. I am wondering along the lines of the love letters, because I feel like Annie's video to me was a little open-ended in terms of, making a recommendation. It was kind of like love letters. If they're sent over, you have to present to your client. I would really love to see us as an association create an advisory that we could provide to our clients and say, here's our position. We are against discrimination as an association, and we think these contribute to it. Here's the advice we're offering you. I want you to instruct me to withhold these when I present offers. Are you in agreement with that? And I think that would be a really great stance that we could take, and some leadership from our association. So just a thought to throw out there, because it is a little gray in terms of our obligation to present. I offer the same advice to my clients, Colleen, but how cool would it be to slide something across the table and just say, here's the position we take, and you can read these later and feel warm and fuzzy.
I wrote that down, Anne, on the to-do list.
It is, often there are a lot of gray areas in terms of what's a fair housing violation and what sort of would contribute as evidence. You know, I would keep encouraging brokers to think about what are our processes, our procedures, our rules. What do we do for everybody? Let's do it for everybody. Another way to think of it is, how would this look? You know, if every customer is a tester, how would what we're doing right now look in comparison with others? And I think often the broker wouldn't know, because we think about this client, and we tend not to think, am I handling this situation, or is this agent handling this situation exactly the same as that agent or another agent would handle a different client? But those two clients may end up testifying back to back in the lawsuit.
Any other questions for Bill? Not seeing any raised hands.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Dedman, for your time today. It was very interesting, and we really appreciate it.
You're all very kind. I urge you to share our work with your colleagues and your friends, and see what reactions they have. You know, someday when we're all back in an office together, we can put it up on the big screen and all watch the 40-minute documentary. Thank you all very much. It's gratifying that you would have a journalist, an outsider. I usually get thrown out of places like this. Have us come in and meet with you. I really appreciate it.
You're always welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. So normally we'd be having our installation banquet this month, but we've opted to move it to